So in this video I'm going to cover playing chords in open position, or that is playing chords with both hands. Now doing this essentially gives you a bit more of a sort of a more well-rounded, nicer sounding chord. So something like this rather than this. And it'll make your song sound sort of a bit more professional and a bit more sophisticated. So firstly, playing a chord in closed position essentially means playing all the notes within the space of an octave. So a D minor 7 would look something like that, right? An octave there, and all the notes fit in that octave. Playing in an open position means playing over a greater distance than an octave. So something like that. So you've still got the root, 3rd, 5th and 7th, but you're playing it over a greater distance. It's open. Right, so as I just said, playing in open position gives you a bit more of a well-rounded, sophisticated sound, and as the name implies, it makes the chord sound a bit more open. That is, the intervals between each note, rather than being sort of stacked thirds, is like a 7th, a 4th, and then a 3rd. And that gives a bit more of an open sound. So essentially, if an improviser, whether it's you or someone else, is sort of playing over the top of that, they can still use effectively any notes in this sort of octave range. Whereas if you're playing a block chord in closed position, you almost kind of rule out this one octave for the improviser, because you've already effectively covered all the notes. If he starts improvising in this octave range, it's going to start sounding a little bit sort of cluttered and busy, and maybe like you're getting in the way of the improviser. Generally then the improviser would want to sort of stay above the chord and improvise in this range, but by playing an open position, you quite literally give the improviser a bit more room to improvise in whatever range he wants by giving your chord a more open sound. So a good way to start playing in open position is doing essentially what I was just doing now, playing two notes with your left hand and 2 notes with your right hand. Of course, you don't have to do this. You can play 1 and 3 if you want, but for the moment let's just stick to sort of splitting up the chord to play 2 in your left hand and 2 notes in your right hand. And so there are a few general rules that you should try and follow when voicing chords in an open position. So the first one is you should try to avoid doubling. That is, you should try to avoid playing the same notes twice in a chord voicing. So this is D minor 7, and each note is played once. The root, the 3rd, the 5th and the 7th. You should try to avoid doing things like this. So here I've played the 7th, the C, twice. And so that skews the sound of this chord sort of towards the C and sort of makes the chord sound a bit lopsided. So generally that's avoided. The second rule is that you generally want the melody note to be on top. Now I'll go through an example later in this video to make this point clear. But essentially, if you've got a D minor 7 in a chord progression and the melody note is an A, so the 5th, you want to put the A on top. If on the other hand you've got a D minor 7 chord in a chord progression and the melody note is an F, you should put the F on top. Right? Nice and simple. Now, the one exception to the doubling rule is that if the melody note is a root note, or the D in this case, then you're allowed to double the root note, the bass note effectively, the root. So you're allowed to do something like that. So you've got the 1, 3, 5, 7, and then the 1 is doubled. But if that 1 is the melody note, then that's okay, because you sort of want the 1 in the bass as well to hold the whole chord form together, and you're allowed to double the melody note in this circumstance. Now, of course, if the note in the melody is not a chord tone or a note in the chord, then you can just add it on top. So if like the melody note is an E, you can just do something like, and just play an E at the top there. And that's perfectly fine. You end up with a D minor 9 chord then, with that 9 on top, which is fine. And of course, if the melody moves around, you can use sort of these free fingers you have at the top to play the melody at above the chord that you're playing in open position. Right? Or something like that. Now, as I mentioned, when playing these open position chord voicings, you want to start at least by playing 2 notes in your left hand and 2 notes in your right hand. Now, the third rule is that you want to avoid playing the interval of a fifth in your left hand. So you can play a third or a seventh, or what's often done, and you should try doing this if you can reach it, is playing a tenth instead of a third. So you just move that third up an octave and you play a tenth. And again, because that gives you a wider interval, and so you've got a bass part and I suppose a little middle tenor part, it gives sort of a much fuller, nicer sound as well compared to just a third. For the same reason that an open position chord sounds nicer than a closed position chord, a tenth, because of it's even more open, it's a wider interval, generally sounds nicer, or is considered to sound nicer than a third. And so then obviously the 2 notes you don't play in your left hand, you play in your right hand. So you get the full chord. Pretty self-explanatory. So I said at the beginning that playing in open position gives you a much more sophisticated and nicer, more well-rounded sound. So let's have a listen to the difference. So first in closed position. Sounds alright, but as I said, not a little bit call and responsey. It's not really quite well rounded. Whereas if I played in open position, so something like this, it sounds a bit nicer and more well-rounded, sounds a bit more sort of professional, I suppose. And so I also mentioned at the beginning, when you're voicing these open position chords, you want to put the melody note on top. So let's take Satin Doll as our jazz standard, and again I'll show you the difference between a closed and an open position. So in closed position we'd play something like this. So that sounds nice, but now listen to it in open. Right, so hopefully you hear that sounds a bit more sort of professional and sophisticated and well-rounded, because you've got sort of the bassier notes, but also sort of, you've split up the chord. It sounds a bit more open because the intervals between the notes are a bit larger. So there, what I did was, Satin Doll begins on a D minor 7, and the note is an A, so I put the melody note at the top. So then it moves to a G7, and it's got the root on top, so I played a chord voicing like that, and then I doubled the root, which again, as I said earlier, is allowed, and went. And then I just repeated the same thing a whole tone higher, so. And so that's what I mean by put the melody note on top. When the melody's in A, you play a chord voicing with the A on top in an open position, so split up over 2 hands and over a greater than an octave distance. And so doing that and practicing up songs like that can give you a much more sort of nicer, well-rounded sound. And so once you can do that, you can start getting into more interesting two-handed open chord voicings, like the So What chord voicing, or the Kenny Barron chord voicing, or things like that, which again I'll cover in the coming videos. But for the moment, just practice that up. Take a block chord, split it up, putting either the root, the third, the seventh, or the 10th in the left hand, and the other two notes in the right hand, and try to play a really simple melody like Satin Doll. Cool, thanks for watching. See you guys.